Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we explore how work is transforming one conversation at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen, and today's conversation will ask what happens when demographic declines, AI systems, and outdated definitions of credibility collide at the same time. What happens when organizations say they can't find the right talent on the one hand, while millions of capable people remain underutilized? And what happens when AI systems challenge the very definitions of credibility, employability, and access to labor markets? My guest today is Greg Haile, CEO of Upwardly Global. Greg is also a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and although he's not speaking on their behalf, he also serves as the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, which enables him to see how the infrastructure behind the labor markets is being reshaped in real time. So today we're going to explore bigger questions beneath all those headlines. How do labor markets decide who belongs in the workforce of the future? Greg, welcome to the Future of Less Work.
Thank you, Nirit. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me. And I actually am really interested in hearing your perspective because of all these roles that you're sitting in. Everyone's talking about AI disrupting jobs. And here we are talking about gaps between people and availability of talent. So which is it? We don't need people, or we won't have the people we need?
Well, I think it's a combination of the two. So it's one of these realities that we are looking at a time unlike any other that we've had in human history, in American history. One, which jumps out, as you just talked about, AI is something that has captured everyone's imagination. Everyone's thinking about the possibilities. And frankly, many of us are thinking about the risks as it relates to workforce and workforce need. Part of that engages the question of you have those who are being exposed to it, and those with that exposure are taking advantage of it, and we're leaning into them and making sure that hopefully everyone has an opportunity to leverage AI from a personal and professional capacity. But then we also have some of the realities around this question around how do we make sure that people are not falling behind, that the exposure is there for all of those in the economy with the skills and the ability, but may not be otherwise exposed to that opportunity.
You jumped right into how do we prepare the workforce, the potential workforce, education, all the systems, right? Upward mobility, is it working for or against? What do you think? Because we're not doing that now. So what do you think we should be doing?
Well, there's a couple of ways to think about it. We have had in this country for a very long time the question about who engages in opportunity and on the front end and who misses out on opportunity. When you think about the traditional post-secondary workforce development opportunities, we know that for decades, we've seen challenges when it comes to low-income communities or those who are otherwise unexposed to opportunity and getting them ingratiated in opportunity. So one of the questions when it comes to AI is, what does it look like to hopefully not widen the gap of opportunity, but to leverage it in a way that narrows the gap when it comes to opportunity?
And how do we do that?
Well,
how do we do it in the, because we haven't been, because we looked at universities or colleges, right, as a means to create the resume you need to get into higher income salaries. We have had issues with that. Now, we've been talking about the skills economy for a really long time, but we don't know how to bring people in on skills versus on credits. How is AI going to change that, or how should we work around AI to enable that?
So I think it's actually, so you asked about, whether or not there's not enough talent in this sphere. And so I'm actually going to tie this piece to what I started to touch on, and that is just we have less people moving into the economy and economic opportunity. So we know, for example, I don't know if our audience has been aware of this, but by 2030, we're looking at, for the first time in our country's history, we will have deaths outpacing births in the United States of America. We also know that we have been short in terms of fertility and birth rates, and some of those things are starting to manifest themselves now, whether it be those number of students who are graduating from high schools, those who are entering post-secondary attainment, and those who will otherwise be able to enter the workforce. And so you have this reality, two things that are happening that are significant, at least. One, you have this narrowing of the pipeline, right? Those traditional pipelines of, wait for those to graduate high school, wait for them to graduate college, and then move them into the workforce. But just the sheer number of people available by way of those pipelines are dwindling, and there's no real reversal that we're seeing. We may see it in labor participation rates that are declining. But the other part of this, Nirit, is also the reality of those many that we have on the sidelines, right? So think about for Upwardly Global, for example, a huge part of our remit is to think about what does it look like for the highly skilled, highly educated 2+ million immigrants that are in this country that are work authorized. They might be doctors, they might be engineers, they might be technologists, but yet and still their talent and capacity is massively underutilized because they're doing things that are far from the skills that they have developed. We have not figured out in an optimal way, I would argue, as a nation, what it looks like to make sure that 2+ million highly skilled, highly educated population is within the workforce to help fill those gaps that would otherwise might be supported simply by the availability of talent.
So you don't think that's so I recently actually wrote a Forbes article about the fact that we actually have more people retiring than people entering the workforce,
Sure.
right? And I think part of we're looking at AI right now and we're worried that it's going to take up jobs because we're thinking, here and now, and we're seeing the headlines, right? But when you look at these numbers, understanding where we utilize human capability, skills, and value add into work versus where technology can step in and release humans to do what only humans can do, which we haven't figured out what it is yet. If you're just putting on another forcing function. You're basically saying, okay, we had a lot of people, we could afford to underutilize some of them, right?
Yeah.
We
And I would
can't
say,
anymore.
and I wouldn't say, I'm putting on the forcing function. What I'm saying in a different way is the demographics that are immutable, essentially, are what inevitably will force our hand when it comes to talent that is on the sideline. So whether it be, this is again not a new story, but it's a very different framework where, as we think about employers and looking for talent, oftentimes we look in very traditional places, right? We look at our own personal networks and the like, but what does it look like to think about those who are not within our traditional networks? And particularly, again, if I think about ready now talent, what does it look like to leverage talent that is already developed, already skilled, already waiting, already ready, but waiting and
So
figuring
what
out.
are we doing? Why are we missing them? Is that because we're looking at the resume line of the school and we're not recognizing the name of the school? Why are we missing them?
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons that you might see it. So, one, when talent is coming from abroad, oftentimes the credentials, the credentials don't necessarily align perfectly. And so that gets missed. Sometimes it's as simple as someone has transitioned from another country and they're here, they might have gaps in their resumes. And sometimes, as we know, employers will see a gap in their resume and they may say, oh, well, that might be problematic. Sometimes, again, they're not coming out of traditional networks because these 2.5 million people, they often don't have, just like anyone else who's coming to a new place, they don't have a network that aligns with the opportunities. And so part of what we do at Upwardly Global is help facilitate that network to make sure that the employers who otherwise don't see that talent because they're just typically unexposed by way of the pathways that exist. What does it look like to work with an organization like us to say, oh, well, you do have exposure to this high skill, high talent, and of course, other workforce organizations as well, but to be thoughtful about this area of talent and what it looks like to say, this is a different pathway that I have to explore. So the question, if you were to aim it more broadly, it's how is it that employers are going about identifying new pathways to talent that otherwise didn't exist to us or within our networks?
So let me try to push on this for a second,
Sure.
a little bit more, right? I think employers have tried and are still trying. I think we're seeing a lot of technology step in to try to understand the talent I need to do the work that I need that is disconnected from the way we used to measure talent, which is credentials, right? With the school you went to and the degree you have and the profession you studied. And you could assume that the more we're able to look for skills and demonstrated skills, the better off people would be if they're coming up through pathways that the standard doesn't recognize, right?
Mhm.
I think instead of maybe educating employers who are, by the way, trying to get rid of the problem by just introducing technology, which I think has always been this way. maybe we should be educating people to showcase their skills in a way that they will filter through the systems, the AI systems that are going to, look for them.
Oh, I could not agree. That's not a pushback at all. I couldn't agree with you more. So among the things that we do as we think about the talent that comes through Upwardly Global, for example, is that so they're adjusting, much like anyone else might be adjusting to, what it looks like to, apply for a job or to build a network. Although it's a little bit more challenging because they're new to this entire nation, right? And
Yeah.
so they have to figure out how the systems work. And so a significant part of the work that we actually do with our Upwardly Global job seekers is around what does it look like to make sure they know how to interview or know how to present themselves in a way that is skills focused, as opposed to simply saying, well, I've had this job in the past, or displaying their credentials in a way that don't speak to the skills. What does it look like to make sure your resume speaks to the skills that you have, that you can tell the story of your capacity in a way that speaks to your journey, which speaks to skills in and of itself, but also the actual real life work that you've had as a doctor or technician or whatever it may be. And speaking from a skills-based perspective, which I think is incredibly important in this world, and not like it used to be, because the pace, as you know, with which skills needs change are critical. And so part of what we have to ask the people who are seeking these jobs is, what are you doing to take upon yourself the ability to increase your skills in a way that matches the change in skills as required by employers? Unlike any other time, skills atrophy far quicker than they have in the past.
Oh, yeah. And that's true for everyone.
It's true for everyone. That's right. It's true for everyone. So the question for everyone, and any job seeker for that matter, is to say, how do I make sure that, notwithstanding the atrophy of skills that I've had, how do I continue to grow my skills over time? And frankly, the way I think about it is over the life of your career, because these skills will continue to change. This is the slowest pace that we will ever be in, is right now. And so the question becomes, how do we make sure that we adjust, whether it be our mindset, our behaviors, and certainly our talents and skills over time, to make sure that we're adjusting as the marketplace needs it.
So we talk about skills, but there's also the uniquely human skills, right? It's what is it that makes you uniquely human in an AI world, in whatever profession you are? Where are we learning those?
Yeah. So this speaks to, as we think about the changes in dynamics, there are things that we've been talking about for years, Nirit, but we really haven't figured out. And now we're being forced to figure them out. Things that we've talked about for years is, what does it look like to make sure that everyone has the critical thinking skills to navigate their lives and navigate the economy? Unlike any other time, critical thinking skills are absolutely important. And that is especially so in an AI-driven world. As we talk about AI being a companion, hopefully one day, to us all, not just some of us, what does it look like to be able to challenge what we're learning, to speak to what we're learning, to grow from what we're learning through the companionship of AI, and being able to work alongside of it in a way that is a true partner, a true thinking partner. But in order to be a true thinking partner, they both have to be thinking, right? And this idea of, obviously, the rote behaviors that have existed in the past and have allowed many of us to have careers, those are going away and will continue to do so. And this is part of where the challenge is. And this is where, going back to the point of personal responsibility, and certainly in partnership with organizations that can be helpful, to grow from a critical thinking perspective. And those skills seem to be those that are right now continue to exist, and throughout the future, we imagine will continue to be necessary, but certainly more so than some of the more standard things
And
that we've had.
do you think that, one of the things that always bothers me is, even when we say we give them names, like critical thinking, I'm not sure critical thinking of 10 years ago and critical thinking of today is the same critical thinking. So, the nuances of what the skills are and how do we train for them. And I also wonder, since you're talking about, the idea of immigrant population that doesn't look like the type of talent that you would use to filter, I wonder if the tools shouldn't be helping, because they're supposed to be able to look at signals that maybe humans, would miss.
Yeah, I think that could certainly be the case, right? We want to be able to leverage these tools in a way that support any gaps. That would be ideal, right? To be able to leverage the tools in a way that be able to support gaps. But even the skill in and of itself is to be able to say, oh, we have a gap and this can help fill it. Right. It's the funny thing. I started my career as a securities litigator. And of course, one of the things that we're seeing in the workplace is, whether or not lawyers are first year, second year, third year lawyers are compromised by the existence of AI and whether or not we need them anymore. You see that in the consulting space as well. And what I also am noticing is that I've actually talked to folks in the field. And one of the things that they're doing is they're actually saying, we do not want our younger lawyers actually using AI in any, or at least limiting how they're using it, because they need to allow them to develop those thinking skills that come with the practice that otherwise might be offset by AI, so that when they are senior lawyers, they actually know how to use the tools in a way where they can spot the gaps, right? And
Yeah.
a big part of the role of that world is understanding issues and spotting them. And so, yes, if you're going to use it in a way that is identified in a companionship model or in a way that you work alongside, you have to be able to have even those fundamental skills to identify where those gaps need to be filled and where they can be filled by these tools of new technology.
Yeah, and the problem of gaining experience is when the entry level activities and jobs that usually were your path to gain experience are disappearing. That's true across all the or many of the professions these days.
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think, when you look at the assumptions that we're making about labor markets, on the fact that they no longer match reality. We talked about the fact that we don't necessarily have all the people we need. And I know you focused on the immigrant population, or, the people who our systems haven't normally been able to pick up as an example. What other assumptions are we making about how we work in the labor market that you think are going to drastically change?
Well, I would say, so whether it's, as we think about talent that otherwise has been disengaged, we talked a little bit about that earlier, right? What does it look like to make sure we're not missing on populations? I've identified the immigrant population, which is a huge part of our work with Upwardly Global. But then you're also thinking about, just other pockets of communities where we may have missed when it comes to an employer perspective. And I think coming down to this networking piece, most jobs come from, if you're in a room full of 100 people, you ask them, have you ever gotten a job by way of your network? And most people will raise their hands, right? And so the question becomes, what does it look like to change that dynamic, right? What does it look like to be, whether it be, again, the personal responsibility of the job seeker to say, I'm going to find ways to expand my network. Now, we know job seekers, if you've ever been without a job and you've had bills to pay, that is a time of not just great anxiety, but they're working really hard to try to figure out what does it look like to do whatever it takes to get in a position. The other piece to it, of course, is for, as we mentioned, employers to be able to expand their networks and figure out what it looks like to grab folks that otherwise they weren't looking in terms of those pockets to be able to do so. So that's
Do you
where
think there's a geographical element in it? So this whole idea of work shifting away from being a place, and so expanding the ability to work from wherever talent is?
Well, hopefully that creates more opportunity. And so as you think about obviously people's ability to move and certainly to move towards opportunity is key. But then you also still have the reality of jobs being posted for remote positions and online positions. And so the geographic piece is very key. When we think about the density of the populations that we serve at Upwardly Global, we know that there's a tremendous amount of high skilled yet underemployed immigrants legally who are here, and you could identify the states: New York, San Francisco.
So why? So explain that to me. I mean, people, if you go back to New York and San Francisco, employers are looking for good talent. You're
right.
saying they are good talent. They're skilled at what you need. Why don't we see them?
Well, I think part of the reason, it's not a matter of not, I think part of the problem, again, it speaks to how, I would ask, how good are we at making sure, as employers, at identifying talent that is undercapitalized and available, right? And
Okay,
so,
let me rephrase that for you. It's how
sure.
good are we at identifying talent that we need, but it doesn't come in the packages that we're used to looking for?
Well, and that's certainly right. That certainly fits well, and not only that we're looking for, but where we are going to, right? And so, oftentimes as employers, so I'll give you a great example. Oftentimes as employers, we're thinking about who is applying and who is coming to us, right? That means the job seeker has to find a way of knowing about the opportunities that exist, right? The onus
Yeah,
being
that
on.
depends on how much pay we're in, because having been on the other side for decades, when we need good people, we actively go looking for them and we try to get really creative. We just
Well,
don't know how to measure things we don't understand, right?
Well, I think they're both true. You may not know how to measure things you don't understand and or how to capture, right? Or how to engage, or maybe if it's even a talent recognition issue, right? That could be
Yeah.
part of it too.
Or by the way, filter them in, help them get through the process. So we absolutely, that's why DEI has always kind of stepped in, because we absolutely don't know how to even our filtering systems, and not just, even if you come in for an interview, if your language skills aren't, what
Sure.
people are used to, automatically there are assumptions. I mean, I'm a non-English speaker. I can tell you the assumptions that people make intuitively about who you are and how capable you are. If your language doesn't sound like what everybody else sounds like around you, that there's an issue there.
And how quickly we are willing to dismiss that talent as well.
Yeah, because we can, which is where we started, right? Maybe we are not going to be able to. Maybe the tools will be able to bridge the things that we couldn't bridge before. I'm
Sure.
thinking, even you look at social media and you think everybody's writing in this perfect English, and you kind of say, okay, you didn't write this, and I can recognize the AI speak inside. And I was actually wondering whether the fact that AI is bridging culture and language for immigrants these days, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because people are recognizing AI speak it. So suddenly I write you off because it looks like AI wrote the text.
And so one of the things that's true. And so one of the potentials here is let's just, if we start with the recognition that a lot of times employers may not get it right, right? They might make they don't have the expertise. It's music to my ears when I hear employers talking about this at scale, about the need for talent, about the need to recognize the capacity for talent, and they speak at a very high level. But there's also a reality. This is not what they necessarily specialize in, right? And certainly some organizations. And so then you have the question of the individuals who have all the talent, but they do not necessarily have the things that we described, like the network or the know-how or these things. And that is where these intermediaries come in. And it really is, in some respect, a responsibility of some of these partners, whether they be higher education institutions, whether they be upwardly global, or others who have a responsibility for figuring out what does it look like to play matchmaker, if you will, and help distill some of those challenges that neither of them have expertise in, but we can help provide some of that support as well.
Yeah, it's interesting if we, if we'll continue to see the movement of people to work versus, which is what a lot of immigration is, right? Versus work to people, which might actually change um, even the idea of maybe my access to talent doesn't need to go through hiring local talent. Maybe I can hire talent wherever it is, and then we will learn how to do that.
I think that's right. Well, and so again, even what you're talking about speaks to some of these realities that we'll have to confront as we think about the
Yeah.
shortage of talent, right? As we think about the shortage of human capital, and what's it look like to think very differently about not just waiting for talent to come to us as employers, but thinking about what does it look like to have a mechanism that identifies talent as it is available.
Yeah.
So when you think about these realities, that you have millions of people, high skilled, highly degreed, and highly experienced. So we have to get to an answer to that question, right? That, as well as 6.5 million job openings that exist, we have to think about what does it look like to solve for those realities. And yes, we've had an alignment mismatch that we know exists, but there have to be solutions that grow into this. And you find this in pockets, but the reality is also very hard to scale some of these challenges
What's
as
an
well.
example of a solution to a mismatch? Because I'm thinking there are industries like healthcare that really need talent, and I don't know if you're saying that it exists out there, but what kind of solution would bridge the mismatch?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're actually quite proud of is just very recently, we ended up placing 19 doctors who were trained abroad in matches with residency programs just about a month ago. And they were here in the US. Obviously, we know that there's a significant shortage in the healthcare space, doctors, nurses, and the like. And some of those, at least one of the stories that jumps out at me is about a doctor who was actually living 20 minutes from the hospital that she's now at, that was looking for talent. And so the thought logically about those two things being true, high need in the healthcare space, doctors from abroad who are here, but essentially facing challenges such as what's it look like to get recredentialed? What's it look like to understand the process for recredentialing? What's it look like to find the scholarship resources for recredentialing? What's it look like to make sure they know how the match process works? What's it look like for resume coaching? What is it? All of these things that come into play. And on the flip side of that, there are too many stories to be told that I've heard personally around folks who have medical degrees, but for the last 20 years have been driving a taxi or been doing something along those lines simply because they could not figure out how to make it work.
Okay.
And so you have to think about the pathways of this high skilled talent that's coming from abroad, and what's it look like to make sure that we're interjecting at the source of those pathways and inevitably working with them to align with their skills and experience with the needs that we know inevitably in this case that make a difference, not just for themselves, but for the lives of others.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I definitely hear you say, why didn't a hospital think that there are people out there that they can help them, overcome these barriers? Or actually have I have an example of a medical facility that discovered that they had in non-medical professional roles people with medical experience and credentials, just not in that country. Because they couldn't, like you said, they couldn't get, the credentials translated, and they went through and helped them do it. And then they gained, the professional employees.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
so
right.
You'd expect. So as we kind of think this through, I'm wondering when you think a few years, into future, when people look back at this period, what do you think they'll say we misunderstood about how work is changing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that they'll say we misunderstood, and I hope we can correct for soon, is that part of this, it is wonderful and imperative that we focus on the individual. That's one. It is wonderful and imperative that we focus on the business needs when it comes to human capital and growing business. But one of the things that we don't talk about nearly enough is what this means for our nation's economy and what this means for our nation's competitiveness. And we really have to think holistically about that. When I think about the underemployed immigrants in this country, the last piece of data, although I know it's significantly more, the last piece of data I've seen that speaks to what they value in terms of lost annual wages is over $40 billion annually. And that data, frankly, we need to update it, but that data is over 10 years old, and we know that it's grown over time. And so we're watching $40 billion of loss in terms of annual wages and consumerism, and what that means for tax revenue, what that means for our nation. And inevitably, as we think about depopulation, not just here, but abroad, what's it look like from our global competitiveness perspective? So when I think about the future and how we look back on it, it's not just the individual life and the important doctor that finally got the opportunity, or the one that didn't, and the lives that they touched. But what did it mean for our businesses, our nation from an economic perspective, and what did it mean for our nation from a global competitiveness perspective?
Yeah, so you're basically saying the mismatch is costing us at the individual level, the organizational level, and definitely the national level. We should go figure it out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. So really, one last question I always close with. What do you think is the question we should all be asking ourselves about the future of work?
The question we should ask ourselves about the future of work is, what does it look like to make sure we are far more productive than we've ever been, and at the same time, making sure that there's greater satisfaction in the lives of those who are moving the needle of productivity.
Yeah, it's very interesting that it's almost like whatever the conversation we're having, we always gravitate to, can we make work more meaningful, more, enjoyable, do the things that make us happy and productive, not just for the sake of,
That's right.
running faster on the treadmill. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg, for joining me today. And for more about Greg Haile, check out the links in the episode description. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow The Future of Less Work wherever you take your podcasts. And remember, your best people do not work because you tell them to. They don't work because you measure them on it. They work because they want to, because by working for you, they're doing what's important to them in life. Till next time.